Hey everybody, it's that time again. It's 8:30, so 8:30 live. I hope everybody had a delightful weekend. The weather was certainly prime enough. Uh, did I go outside? I definitely did go outside. I went for a walk and everything. I might have even done some Tai Chi. In fact, I did for like an hour yesterday. Anyway, the weekend was great. I hope you had a great time too. The one thing I didn't do was have any brews, and I think as the weather gets nicer, it's going to be harder and harder for people to resist the temptation to go outside and congregate en masse and drink on the street, which is going to make social distancing difficult. In fact, 2 weekends ago, we already saw how incredibly hard it was going to be to keep New Yorkers away from each other. So just something to keep in mind as the weather gets warm. You can be one of those folks who reminds people social distancing is still in effect. That being said, this takes us to, I guess, the first topic of the evening. Because, there are a few things, I write things down that I read throughout the day and what have you. First thing, herd immunity. Because I read an article about this the other day, and then I posted it up online and got some comments on it. Because I actually do have some folks who are Facebook friends of mine who are very much into the herd immunity theory. And I just want to run down, for those who don't know, what herd immunity is, how it works, and whether or not it makes sense. And of course, whether or not it makes sense is completely up to you as an individual. It is an opinion you can hold, but let's just sort of go over what it means. Basically, the idea of herd immunity, and let me just put this down now that the sharing is done and all that. The idea of herd immunity is that as people are exposed to the virus, they develop resistance to it. And then once enough people have resistance to a virus, it stops spreading. Basically, because when somebody gets sick with it and they go to pass the virus on to somebody else, it can't find anybody who's susceptible. So the herd immunity rate is then relative to how infectious the disease is. So the R naught, or the replication rate. If you have a low replication rate, which is to say, like, for example, 3, which the coronavirus is, that means that every person passes it on to 3 more people in a set period of time. And if you have a high abundance of immunity, it's not going to find 3 people to move to before you overcome the disease. Meanwhile, or alternatively, if you have a very high R naught, it means that one individual passes it on to many individuals, which means that the more infectious a disease is, the more immunity you need in the population to prevent it from passing on, because it will move much more quickly between folks. Okay, so as I mentioned, coronavirus, while infectious, is not nearly as infectious as something like, say, the mumps, which really you need a ridiculous amount of herd immunity to have it run into a barrier. That being said, coronavirus still, from the numbers I saw, requires a good 55 to 70% of the population to be immune to create walls that it won't be able to get through. Basically, so that if one person in New York City gets it, the odds of that person running into another person who can be infected is below 50%. Because if you cut off if the virus replicates, if the virus is not super duper transmissible, and every person you come into contact with is immune, you just can't pass it on. All right. So the idea of herd immunity is that you let the virus run rampant. That way, everybody, not let the virus run rampant per se. That's not how it's phrased. But basically, let the virus run its course, have a controlled spread through the population so that you don't overwhelm the medical system. But basically, because we're not going to have a vaccine for a long time, let people get it and then develop an immunity, and then you'll eventually achieve herd immunity. But ultimately, the reality of this is that you're simply allowing the virus to spread, albeit in a semi-controlled manner, if you can manage it, to prevent the healthcare system from being overwhelmed. But still, the virus spreads to basically everyone. Now, the goal here is to not have to shut down the economy and to have society become resistant to the virus. But at the end of the day, it means everybody gets it. Hopefully, most people come out of it okay. And the people that don't, just get sick and maybe die, but they're not immune, right? So at the end of the day, you're just left with all the immune people. So the herd immunity model is basically the Darwinian model, right? And they say it means herd immunity, and certainly you'll achieve herd immunity by killing all the people who aren't immune. There you go. So this has been seen, some might argue this is quite a callous view. And again, they will stress the fact that this is supposed to be done in a controlled fashion so that, you can have social distancing, but there's no point in just locking down the economy, because if you social distance and you wear masks, you'll enable the healthcare system ideally to cope with the influx of patients. And most importantly, to folks professing the herd immunity program or solution, they are concerned that the death rate due to the side effects of economic consequences will be greater than or magnify the death rate due to pure COVID-19 related disease consequences. So you can imagine, somebody posted that there'll be a pandemic of hunger because there'll be a lack of food production, etc. You might think of all the folks who people are concerned they'll commit suicide because they get depressed in social isolation. This is there are certainly other aspects of the lockdowns that are external or extraneous to its impact on the virus, the way it impacts society and the economy, and the way and ability of people to access other things that they need, either psychological or financial or material. But, from my perspective, and I think the perspective of a lot of folks, all those other things should be able to be taken care of. Certainly, there's not so much you can do with the social distancing insofar as upping human contact. Even this herd immunity model relies on some degree of social distancing to prevent the healthcare system from being overwhelmed. But, in terms of food access and all these other things, those are problems which can actually be solved by coordinated effort from the government and even from private corporations, right? So the herd immunity model, which again is really about just let everybody get it and people who don't die will then be immune and eventually you'll approach herd immunity, is predicated on a sense that the consequences, the death toll of the economic repercussions will be higher than those related to the virus. And ultimately, there's no way to know. All of this is very much up in the air. But this is when Fox News goes on and they're like, reopen the economy. One of their main reasons, well, I don't want to say one of the main reasons, because they think that people will die because of economic consequences. They want to ensure that rich people make money. But that is certainly one perspective and one argument. Of course, Fox News has the best take on the whole thing, which is herd immunity or not. Well, I will say one other thing about the herd immunity theory, which is part of it is you can separate vulnerable populations from at-risk populations so that you can separate vulnerable populations from populations which are likely to cope well with the virus and let the younger folks, for example, go out into the world and develop immunity. And if they have 70 or 100%, then when everybody else gets reintroduced, those young people will basically form a barrier and act as that herd immunity. But that math doesn't work out. I just want to say that right now. That math doesn't work out because young people don't make up 55 to 70% of the population. You can't get enough young people so that an old person or a vulnerable person won't come into contact with them. And the minute they come into contact with them, then they get the virus and the virus starts spreading again. You can't generate herd immunity by separating out vulnerable populations from less vulnerable populations. Because even if you develop some level of herd immunity in the less vulnerable population, when you reintroduce the at-risk people, they will have no immunity and they will just take it back to their communities or they'll just catch it almost immediately. And it doesn't matter that everybody else has a sort of herd immunity because they've been living in a separate society for this whole time. it'll just devastate the new people who come into into contact with the virus. Basically the same way that when Europeans who had a degree of immunity to smallpox came to North America, they just spread it like wildfire because the vulnerable populations here had zero immunity. That's what's going to happen if you try to separate out vulnerable populations from less vulnerable population, then reintroduce them later. You don't get herd immunity that way because as you add people into the herd immunity evaporates. Okay, so you can't do this with just young people. So Fox News, of course, has the hottest take on the whole matter, which is just let the old people go back, restart the economy, and then die for young people. And of course, not all old people die from coronavirus. I mean, the death rate is sort of still being determined, but it's not going to kill all the old people. But I love the idea that Fox News is like, let's sacrifice old people, and as a double whammy, the whole point of this is to return to business as usual, to preserve the consumerist, mass production, mass consumption society that we had before. So as old people return to their workforce and die to restart the economy, young people get to watch on in horror as their grandparents and parents die to preserve an economic system that's destroying the planet that they are supposed to live on well after their elders have passed on. So I just think, lots of ways to cope with the virus. But ultimately, I think the simplest and most straightforward one is just to test people, trace contacts, isolate, supported isolation for those who test positive, and then get some fucking PPE out there and remodel your workplaces so that people can be in a safe environment when they go outside. And yeah, therapies and vaccines down the line. Now, speaking of therapies, I did want to bring one piece of news to folks. You might have seen it. It was in the New York Post. It's a real human interest story with a little bit of science on the side. Anyway, I obviously passed it on to my PhD, MD immunologist friend to get his take. But basically, there was a story that a young man who's in medical school saved his mother's life with a miracle supplement, glutathione. No, glutathione. I wish I had better handwriting, and I wish I had written this down. Ugh. Anyway, I'm going to bring it up because, I don't want to get the name wrong for the miracle drug. But I will say that, long story short, or spoiler alert rather, no miracle drug to be had here, necessarily. So basically, the story is that this young man who's in medical school, his mother contracted COVID-19. And in response to this, what I should say is she contracted COVID-19 and had a really bad reaction. She couldn't breathe. She was in the hospital, what have you. So then they gave her hydroxychloroquine and they gave her azithromycin. And that did minimal things. We'll talk about hydroxychloroquine in just a second because there is some new news there. So they gave her hydroxychloroquine and whatever. She's feeling a little bit better, but she still can't really breathe. So her son comes along, talks to the family, talks to a doctor who had treated his sister for Lyme disease. And that doctor immediately says, you should try this supplement. And now I can't find this fracking article, so I can't tell you what it's called. Oh, I know where it is. It's in my messages because I sent it to this guy. I didn't want to just post it up and be like, check out this sweet new coronavirus cure. He says, you should try this supplement, which reduces inflammation. Because what happens is this is a molecule produced by the liver to reduce inflammation. And when you have a virus or another pathogen that's reducing the body's capacity to cope with inflammation, the liver doesn't produce enough to protect the lungs. Interesting theory. Okay, so what did this person do? This young man got this supplement for his mother, gave it to her, and as she tells it, within an hour, she was able to breathe again. She was up, walking around, making her bed. It was a miracle. And this was done once more for another patient who said that they also experienced a miracle recovery because of it. So, and it is called glutathione. So the supplement is glutathione. So I sent this to my doctor friend, and he looked at it and he said that the Post article is hyper misleading. And this is because in the paper so then this young man and the doctor authored a paper about this. And so in the paper, it says that his mother had already been experiencing symptoms for 11 days when the glutathione was administered. The other person who says that this helped them had already been experiencing symptoms for 8 to 9 days. And basically, this is already in the recovery period of the virus. It's completely possible that they were just recovering on their own and this drug were administered at a lucky time. Basically, when they were unlikely to have any relapse or any complications. So this is why randomized trials are so important, because you have all of these correlating factors. Glutathione might be really helpful, but the Post article says really nothing about whether or not it is efficacious. And the study that was filed on these two instances of its administration doesn't seem to lend any credibility to the fact that it was just a fluke. Lend any credibility to the fact that it wasn't just a fluke. So hopefully tests will continue. Again, we've spoken about other potential therapies like remdesivir and an antibody extraction that was done on humanized mice in Israel. These are all, therapies which are being investigated and hopefully have use in the future once we know for sure. But one that doesn't look like it's doing so hot is hydroxychloroquine. And there was another article that came out today that tried to make a sensational headline by saying that that hydroxychloroquine is the most popular treatment for COVID-19 amongst doctors. And if you actually read the article, you see pretty quickly that the survey was amongst 2,000 doctors or so, 2,100, and only 37% of them said that hydroxychloroquine was of any utility. Now, mind you, this is just a survey of doctors. Less than half of them said that hydroxychloroquine was of any utility, and all of the research being done really points to hydroxychloroquine not ending up as a particularly useful therapy for COVID-19. But still, this thing gets propagated, and the news is out there to sell papers and get clicks. And so they run headlines that are like, hydroxychloroquine is the most prescribed medicine to deal with COVID-19. Even if that's true, even if it is, it's meaningless, because asking 2,000 doctors, what do you do? And then having 37% of them say, I think maybe hydroxychloroquine is the top right now, it's totally anecdotal, no science whatsoever. So when you see things like these, I urge you, please click the link, read what it has to say, and remember that a doctor's opinion is still just an opinion, even though they're a doctor. You need to do controlled studies across large numbers of people to know if anything has any actual effect on a disease. Okay, so the last thing I wanted to mention, just for folks, I'll say two more things, and this is really about the Department of Justice. So DOJ, you might have heard Bill Barr let Mike Flynn off, and he had his reasons. He was on some TV show yesterday explaining what they were. I didn't think they were very compelling, but whatever. However, perhaps a little bit more interesting is that 2,000 former Department of Justice officials wrote a letter condemning Bill Barr's actions and calling on him to resign. Now, the number one strength of the Trump administration is that nobody has any shame whatsoever, and they'll just sort of like roll through what they want to do and ignore and in all criticism, and they're completely impervious to public opinion or professional degradation. That being said, you might say, as I did, and even if you don't say it, you should think it, you might say, 2,000, is that a lot or a little for the Department of Justice? Well, DOJ has about 100,000 employees right now, but not all of them are officials or attorneys that are knowledgeable in the legal matters of the DOJ at a professional level. So the real question is then, well, how many attorneys do they have working for them? So they have about 10,000. Now, 2,000 out of 10,000 is pretty sizable, except remember, none of these were current attorneys for DOJ. I don't think an acting, an attorney working for the Department of Justice would ever openly criticize. It would be like somebody in the military criticizing the president or chain of command. You just don't do that. So this was from a set of retired DOJ officials. Now, that pool is probably quite large considering that there's currently 10,000 of them, and you imagine that these things sort of roll over the course of an agency that's been around since the 30s in its current form. But my friend commented, who was a DOJ official, and he said, DOJ, Department of Justice, is the most apolitical and most disinterested, nonpartisan agency. And so for them to take a stand is actually quite meaningful and compelling. Now, I'm taking his word on this. This is his opinion. But when I asked whether this condemnation was meaningful, he, who is somebody who worked at DOJ, said that it was. So I'm saying pretty impressive that 2,000 former officials from DOJ came out and condemned Bill Barr's actions. Speaking of the Department of Justice and the sorts of things it does, Georgia has asked has asked the DOJ to look into the Ahmaud Arbery case, and it looks like they might be pursuing hate crime charges. Now, I find that so interesting, given how we often think about the Trump administration and think about how this White House dispenses justice and thinks about justice. And I say White House because even though DOJ is meant to be independent, it obviously isn't. Bill Barr is obviously very close to President Trump and does his bidding in a lot of ways he probably shouldn't. Michael Flynn situation, just being an example. So that being said, we'll see how that comes out. But I think that Trump thinks he's going to pick up the African American vote with this. It would be nice, of course, to have justice for Ahmaud Arbery, but I don't know if folks are turning around on Donald Trump's treatment of the black community these days, because he's been pretty clear on where he stands as he solidifies his base going into the next election. But whatever. The last thing I wanted to just talk about, since folks have been bringing up questions about autarky and self-sufficiency in the United States for a while, and maybe people are concerned about China and global trade now that our economy is collapsing. The last thing I wanted to mention is that there was an article that the White House is apparently in talks with Intel and TSMC to move microprocessor production onshore in the United States. So basically to move it out of Asia. So Intel, of course, is an American company. They produce some chips here already, but this would be to bring a lot more manufacturing of chips to the United States, and not just for Intel computers, but also for other users of their chips. So right now, Intel produces chips for itself in the United States, but all of its additional chips for other clients are done offshore. TSMC is actually a Taiwanese chip manufacturer, and they have expressed a very open interest in moving some production and operations to the United States. They say that they've always had that interest. But now that the government is really looking to potentially subsidize this activity, we'll see what happens. But, when we spoke about autarky and we spoke about self-sufficiency and the United States bringing everything onshore so that it didn't have to trade anymore, I actually gave the example of computer chips being a thing that are too complicated and require too many specialized supply lines to really meaningfully onshore. But I did give myself the out that if you want to spend enough money to do it, you can get it done. It's just very resource intensive, and it's not the competitive advantage of the US. But here the White House is saying that they might be out there and ready to invest that money to bring the production of these items to the U.S. for national security reasons. And I think that really, the United States is pretty good about taking national security seriously, so long as it means killing other people or depriving other people from the capacity of killing us. Viruses and natural disasters, not so much. Who gives a crap? Why should we do maintenance on flood levees when we could just buy another nuclear missile? But, decisions. In any event, we might see more chips coming stateside, chip production coming stateside, which would be great because my friend then commented on that post that his whole town, or at least some town that he knew, that he lived in, their entire economy was basically based on an Intel chip manufacturing plant until it closed down. So for national security, we're willing to do a lot of things, but I don't really want folks to take away from this that we're trending towards self-sufficiency or autarky here. Again, the United States is a net producer of food, which is great, has something like 70% of the world's fresh water supplies, which is amazing, until we build pipelines over them and ruin them. And we make some steel, but ultimately the United States is not going to benefit from just cutting itself off from global supply chains. There's too much competitive advantage and productive capacity in other parts of the world. But if we had to close everything down, I do think that the United States, amongst the nations of the world, would be one of the most self-sufficient and could survive for a really long time, or certainly survive maybe indefinitely at lower levels of comfort and consumption, maybe forever. I mean, it's a big freaking country. All right, let's see if there's any comments. Otherwise, I sort of talked about all the stuff I wanted to talk about. Oh, Dorian Key, what do you think of Plandemic? I actually spoke about Plandemic yesterday. And if you go to my Facebook page, there are 3 separate articles, all titled Plandemic Debunk 1, 2, and 3. And that's because Plandemic is just so dangerous. I watched the first 25 minutes of Plandemic at like 2x speed. I wasn't going to spend actual 25 minutes of my life on that thing. But, it's very, Plandemic is very well put together. Like, it's very slick. Like, the production value is high. It looks legit. So I watched it and I was like, wow, oh yeah, this looks really legit. Like, the cutaways are nice. The B-roll is nice. Without any external information about who this person is that they're interviewing, Judy Mikovits, I don't know, Dr. Judy. Without any external information about Dr. Judy, you might think this is a very legitimate film espousing a very legitimate position. And at the end, apparently there's like a bunch of other doctors who back up her position. But none of these folks, I mean, it is sort of the point that none of these folks are in any position of power or recognized as experts, because they're all counterculture scientists, counterculture experts who are constantly being silenced because big pharma doesn't hear from them, and big government doesn't want to hear from them. But Plandemic is total nonsense. Again, I read and posted 3 articles about how it's nonsense, and my favorite article amongst them is actually an article from 2012 about Dr. Judy's problems in 2009. So just to say it, because I want people to know, and if you happen to be watching this, and you need your talking points on Plandemic, please know that in 2009, Judy Mikovits, I'm pretty sure it's Mikovits now, Judy Mikovits was a doctor at a foundation that was doing research into chronic fatigue syndrome. The team which she led claimed to find a link to a retrovirus in mice and chronic fatigue syndrome in humans. They published this, and it actually got a fair amount of press and coverage. So much so that when other scientists could not corroborate these findings, could not replicate those results, it created a firestorm in the media. Not least of which because the virus that was found in mice was a retrovirus, And this being 2009, there were a bunch of retroviral drugs for HIV/AIDS that were in circulation, and people started taking them. So because of the retrovirus situation. In any event, the reports ultimately, the attempts to replicate the experiment ultimately failed to find any evidence of this mouse virus in people with chronic fatigue syndrome, which discredited that paper. It was partially retracted by Mikovits. Then it was the error was traced back to shoddy lab work and contamination. Then the journal in which that paper was published completely retracted the article. Then Mikovits was fired, and there was, when she was fired, a situation where it was claimed that she stole proprietary data and lab books and notebooks and such. And as a result, she was arrested. Now, in Plandemic, she says she was arrested actually the host says she was arrested with no charges. And then she implies that she was arrested because they wanted her to be quiet about the truth and that there was a gag order placed on her. But this is not the case. The second article I posted, Plandemic Debunk 1, was actually not even an article about Plandemic. It was an article from 2012 about the retraction of the 2009 paper and the discreditation of this Dr. Mikovits. And so what I really love is that there's contemporaneous report. This was a big enough situation that there's contemporaneous reporting about this person's work, arrest, and that case, which has nothing to do, completely separate from the fact that we happen to be in a pandemic now. So you can't say, oh, it's the powers that be trying to manipulate things or the mainstream media doing whatever bidding. This is reporting that was done concurrently years and years ago, and now can inform the debunking of Plandemic and discredit their main witness, if you will, who is absolutely spouting a certain degree of falsehood. She is a doctor. That's true. She did do research. That's true. She was entirely discredited. And so many other things in that movie are just wrong. So I encourage you to check out the articles on my Facebook, Plandemic Debunk 1, 2, and 3, because, NPR did a debunk today, and that's how you know something's really gone mainstream. NPR just is willing to go and do a thing on it. Let's see if there's anything else. So I hope that answered your question, and that's sort of it for today. I can smell my rice cooking, and it's making me hungry, and kind of a not so heavy news day, and looks like folks are just chilling. So I hope everybody's having a great time, and I really enjoy these little check-ins. So don't be afraid to comment and such. It's good to see everybody, and I'll see you tomorrow at 8:30.